يخشونه ولا يخشون أحدا إلا الله وكفى بالله حسيبا ما كان محمد أبا أحد من رجالكم ولكن رسول الله وخاتم النبيين وكان الله بكل شيء عليما
من أراد مؤنسا فالله يكفيه ومن أراد حجة فالقرآن يكفيه ومن أراد الغنى فالقناعة تكفيه ومن أراد واعظا فالموت يكفيه من أراد مؤنسا فالله يكفيه ومن أراد حجة فالقرآن يكفيه ومن أراد واعظا فالموت يكفيه ومن أراد الغنى فالقناعة تكفيه ومن لم يكفه شيء من هذا فإن النار تكفيه. ابن آدم
arguably one of the most eloquent and articulate of orators and scholars in the Arabic language known in the 20th century. A man whose voice captured the collective sentiment of a billion believing hearts. A voice that expressed their grievances in the most captivating and charismatic style of elegant and empowering speech. This is the remarkable story of how the courage and determination of an ordinary child helped him overcome the hurdles of physical disability and empowered him to transcend the heights and limits of brilliance in his passionate pursuit of justice, truth, and equality. Hamid Kishk, an ordinary child who would grow up to live an extraordinary life, was born in a modest village near the Egyptian city of Alexandria in the year 1933. He was born within just a decade after the last Muslim ruler under the Ottoman Caliphate was forcefully removed, following the abolition of the Islamic ruling system that had previously governed the Muslim world undisrupted for over 1400 years. Hamid was fortunate to have been in the presence of his father during his infancy. However, this paternal bond would be severed while he was still very young in age, when his father passed away, making the young Hamid an orphan. The tragic death of his father would undoubtedly have had a noticeable impact in the life of the child, but his difficulties were soon to take on an additional dimension of hardship and adversity. Barely in his early teens, the orphan began to suffer from a medical condition that gradually took away his eyesight and left him deprived of his vision altogether. The sudden affliction of blindness and the restrictive nature of his visual incapacity could have sufficed and served as the perfect excuse to give up on life and to surrender to the pessimistic tendencies that come so easily to most people during times of tribulation and hardship. Yet in the life of Hamid Kishk, such hurdles proved to be agents of positive change and catalysts for his advancement and eventual growth. His visual impairment became a motivation rather than an impediment. It enabled and empowered him to reach targets that many of his peers could not even perceive. His early losses and afflictions stirred in him the spirit of determination and purpose, and infused his heart with the ardent desire to excel in his studies despite being blind. The young orphan was enrolled into a local elementary school, wherein he completed his memorization and study of the glorious Quran by the tender age of 10. Soon after graduating from elementary school, the prodigious child was accepted into a religious seminary in Alexandria, and by the second year of his course, he was already being awarded perfect grades in his examinations. His academic abilities singled him out from the other students, and he was recognized for his hard work and piercing intelligence. At the end of his secondary education at school, the young Hamid was ranked first in the National League of Examination Results and was subsequently accepted to study at the Faculty of Theology at the prestigious University of Al-Azhar in Cairo, Egypt. Hamid Kishk was not the average student. He achieved more than his peers and faced many challenges during his academic pursuits. His experience at the University of Al-Azhar granted him the training and religious formation that would transform him into a world-class scholar and an orator in years to come. Soon after Hamid Kishk completed his graduate studies at the University of Al-Azhar's Faculty of Usuluddin, he was granted the leadership of a local mosque, wherein he would be responsible for delivering weekly sermons and leading the prayers. A few years later, in 1957, Sheikh Hamid Kishk returned to the University of Al-Azhar as a lecturer in the Faculty of Theology, a position that came with much authority and recognition in the scholarly circles of Egypt. But perhaps his most significant appointment came in the year 1964, when Sheikh Hamid Kishk was elected to deliver religious sermons at the Ain al-Hayat Mosque situated in Cairo. He would continue to occupy this post for several decades. Sheikh Hamid Kishk was a graduate of Al-Azhar University and received his religious instructions in the classical traditions. He was well versed with Arabic poetry, grammar, morphology, and rhetoric, for which he became famous. He was also a qualified scholar of religious law and a memorizer of the glorious Quran. Yet despite his high attainments and scholarly accolades, Sheikh Hamid Kishk endeared and mesmerized his congregation by adorning his speech with classical Arabic, but anchoring the message with colloquial euphemisms and idiosyncratic expressions that the laity could understand and appreciate. His tapes and recordings were widely circulated, and the listeners hung onto every word he uttered with a sense of deep curiosity and genuine interest in what he had to convey of the Quranic message and the prophetic teachings. Perhaps what made him dearer to the generality and drew them closer to his lectures was his witty command of language and his sharp sense of humor. It is said that Sheikh Hamid Kishk had an unusual ability to humor his congregation, but then draw them to tears while delivering sermons on a single topic. His recorded lectures were copied and broadcast from Cairo to Casablanca. His words reached listeners from the heart of Medina to the streets of Marseille. In fact, so captivating and unique was his style, and so charismatic was his delivery, that a Saudi-funded newspaper once described him as the star of Islamic preaching. The title did not fall short of merit, as it was generally acknowledged that few speakers indeed possessed the oratory command of classical and contemporary Arabic the way he did. He also possessed the powerful gift of vocal versatility that enabled him to animate his words with an almost poetic and rhythmic mode of delivery. It is not an exaggeration to claim that the Sheikh's panoramic grasp of Islamic and Arab culture, coupled with his phenomenal ability to improvise and respond to critics on the spot, made him a rare sight indeed. His subject matter was also different from the norm. He would inject a healthy dose of reality into his sermons by openly addressing the oppressive nature of the socialist regimes, the tyranny of Arab military dictatorships, and the peace treaties signed with Israel. He even objected openly to the complicity of Al-Azhar in some of the injustices. So tremendous were his sermons that he frequently drew crowds of 10,000 plus on a weekly basis. And as his popularity grew and his influence extended to the surrounding cities and beyond the Egyptian borders, towards the early 1980s, the Ministry of Endowments was obliged to extend the mosque facilities in order to accommodate the growing numbers that would flock to attend his Friday sermons each and every week. But as his profile began to be more and more public, Sheikh Hamid Kishk drew more unwanted attention from the secret services. He was a vocal and unapologetic critic of the Egyptian government. His stance concerning the imprisonment of many clerics and Islamic activists eventually landed him in trouble with the authorities, and he was convicted in 1965 and subsequently jailed for 2.5 years, during which he was subjected to repeated torture and unspeakable cruelty. But not long after his release from prison, towards the early 1970s, Sheikh Hamid Kishk began to intensify his sermons by fearlessly addressing the injustice, moral decadence, and increasingly anti-Islamic legislation that was fast enveloping the Egyptian society. Sheikh Hamid Kishk was an outspoken and courageous critic of popular Arab musicians. He was not afraid to remind the elite that Islam prohibited music and its associated lifestyle. This was particularly bold at a time when musical royalty such as Kulthum, Muhammad Abdul Wahhab, and Fairuz were at their peak, and Western dress was becoming more and more encouraged in Egypt. Sheikh Hamid Kishk was also critical of the oppressive laws and legislation that were disproportionately directed towards Muslim activists, lecturers, and ideologues. He spoke out in defense of many political prisoners and openly supported the right for Muslims to defend and uphold their religious identity by growing the beard and wearing the headscarf in public. By the year 1976, Hamid Kishk was becoming a serious obstacle for the authorities. His direct and brazen honesty in the face of power only made him more and more feared and detested by the political class. This became a greater problem following the presidency of Anwar Sadat and his involvement at the Camp David peace treaty with Israel. Criticism and angry responses from many Islamic organizations resulted in the president's orders for the mass imprisonment of many scholars and orators during the famous September Resolution. Sheikh Hamid Kishk was one of the key personalities targeted during this crackdown operation. As the confrontation grew more serious and more attention was being paid to the Sheikh, he was arrested and apprehended a few more times by the authorities, and in the year 1981, shortly before Anwar Sadat's assassination, Sheikh Hamid Kishk was arrested once more. He was eventually granted freedom during the presidential rule of Hosni Mubarak, under the strict condition that he discontinued his public speaking engagements. Sadly, following his release from prison in 1982, the Sheikh did not return to his mosque to deliver any more of his sermons.
أنا ما زلت أذكر الزنزانة رقم 19 في سجن القلعة يوم دخلتها لأول ليلة في حياتي، وأغلق الباب علي وحدي والظلام دامس، وأخذت أتحسس حوائطها كيف أنام، وأين الفراش الذي أنام عليه، وأين القبلة لأصلي لله، وأين الماء لأتوضأ، وخلعت ملابسي وفرشتها وطويت عمامتي ووضعتها تحت رأسي ونمت ليلتها أشكو لربي ظلم العباد. وقبل أذان الفجر بقليل رأيت في المنام أبا بكر الصديق أمام قصر رسول الله، أمام قبر المصطفى، أمام قبر المصطفى. أبو بكر أمام قبر المصطفى. وتذكرت يوم جلس أبو بكر في الغار ثاني اثنين وقال له الرسول لا تحزن إن الله معنا. وقال لي أبو بكر يا هذا النبي يقرأك السلام ويقول له واصبر لحكم ربك فإنك بأعيننا. وعلمت أن هناك مددا من الله، وأن الله لا يتخلى عن عباده الضعفاء.
During his tenure at the Ain al-Hayat Mosque, Sheikh Hamid Kishk openly lamented the social conditions in Egypt, which were exacerbated by the crackdown directed towards the Islamic movements. However, the underlying current to his narrative was distinctly spiritual and sprung forth from a traditional Islamic orthodoxy, a recurrent theme that colors all of his speech. Unlike a number of scholars and many of his contemporaries, Sheikh Hamid Kishk was not a conformist to the dominant forces of President Gamal Abdel Nasser. The Sheikh was defiantly pro-Islam and anti-secularism. He was a conscientious moral dissident under the brutal socialist regime that controlled the Egypt of his day. This resulted in a total media boycott during the rule of Anwar Sadat between 1970 and 1981. However, the Sheikh's mass appeal and informal distribution network facilitated the continual exchange of recordings and cassettes within Egypt and beyond its borders. However, some of his critics are gravely mistaken in characterizing Hamid Kishk as a political figurehead. This could not be farther from the reality. Though the Sheikh did espouse strong opposing views in light of the socialist state that existed in his time, he was far more involved in discussing the central role of spiritual excellence and personal piety. In many of his speeches, this can be clearly seen as a key theme. The cultivation of the inner configuration of human virtues was as important, if not more urgent, than the political externalities that resulted from man's corrupt spirituality. It was in light of this profound and meaningful struggle that the Sheikh framed his discourse around the concept of a greater jihad. According to his interpretation, jihad is a continual struggle aimed at subduing one's base nature and working to cultivate the soul so that it can be tuned to embody the highest moral standards. Criticism of the self and the cultivation of virtuous traits such as honesty, justice, kindness, and patience form the basis for a type of personal development that would result in creating pious and philanthropic activism, promoting justice and prosperity in society, while combating ignorance, injustice, and oppression.
فعندما أدخل الله تعالى آدم وحواء الجنة قال لهما فلا يخرجنكما من الجنة فتشقى، ولم يقل فلا يخرجنكما من الجنة فتشقيا، إذ أن الرجل هو الذي عليه التكاليف كلها، فإذا خرج من الجنة فهو الذي سيشقى وراء لقمة العيش لأنه مكلف بذلك، ومن ثم فإن الله أمده بقوة في جسمه ليواجه أعباء الحياة. أما المرأة فإن رسالتها رسالة سامية وسامية جدا، إذ هي المدرسة التي تقوم بتربية النشء الصالح، ومن ثم فلا عجب إذا شبهت بأنها مصباح البيت أمدها الله بقوة في عاطفتها وحنانها لتستطيع أن تغذي طفلها وتربيه وتنشئه وتصبر على ما يعود عليه من هذا الطفل من سهر بالليل وعناء بالنهار. ومن هنا فإن العلماء الباحثين يقررون أن الأم عندما ترضع ولدها لا ترضعه لبنا فقط، إنما ترضعه حنانا وتغذيه بعطفها، بحيث أن الطفل إذا ترك صدر أمه تراه يبكي، فإذا حملته سيدة أخرى غير أمه واصل البكاء، فإذا عاد إلى صدر أمه كف عن البكاء. فمن الذي أدراه أن هذه أمه؟ قالوا إنه يعلم صدر أمه بدقات قلبها.
Sheikh Hamid Kishk was a courageous and selfless champion of the common people. Much of his life was given to learning and teaching others. Though he spent a significant portion of his life under the oppression and watchful surveillance of the authorities, and eventually had to serve a number of years in jail, he was still loved and deeply admired by the people, and he continued to inspire hope and optimism in the hearts of a believing people. But as his final day dawned upon him, during the last hour of his eventful life, Sheikh Hamid Kishk prepared himself for the Friday prayers by performing his ablution and heading towards the mosque. He entered the gathering and stood up to perform 2 light units of prayer. It was during the second rak'ah that he went down into prostration and drew close to his Creator. He never raised his head again. Hamid Kishk died on Friday, the 26th of July, 1996. The angel of death claimed his soul while he was in prostration to Allah, the Most Elevated. Sheikh Hamid Kishk delivered his legendary lectures for over 40 years in his evocative and eloquent style of preaching. His command of the Arabic vernacular was unmatched, and his passionate sermons electrified his audiences. He was able to induce tears and possessed the gifted ability to animate large crowds and audiences with uncontrollable laughter, while openly addressing the daily hardship that visited the average man. The public loved him, the scholars respected him, and the tyrants feared him. As Sheikh Al-Khatib Hamid Kishk spoke the language of the scholars, but transmitted the wisdom to the masses in a universal language of courage, empathy, and friendship. May his eyes be awakened to the heavenly sights of Jannatul Firdaus in the company of angels and prophets. Ameen.
الذين آمنوا وتطمئن قلوبهم بذكر الله ألا بذكر الله تطمئن القلوب ألا بذكر الله تطمئن القلوب ألا بذكر الله تطمئن القلوب. أيها الموحدون، من الواحد؟ من الواجد؟ من الماجد؟ من الرحمن؟ من الرحيم؟ من الملك؟ من القدوس؟ من السلام؟ من المؤمن؟ من المهيمن؟ من العزيز؟ من الجبار؟ المتكبر؟ من الخالق؟ من البارئ؟ من المصور؟ من الحكيم؟ من الحليم؟ من العليم؟ من القابض؟ من الباسط؟ من الرافع؟ من الخافض؟ من الجليل؟ من الجليل؟ من القدير؟ من الوكيل؟ من المقيت؟ من الواجد؟ من الماجد؟ من الواحد؟ وحد الواحد.
I believe in brotherhood of all men.
يا حبيبي يا رسولي يا حبيبي يا رسول